I've talked about the Game Boy on this channel a lot, but I've never really explicitly said what my favorite games on the console are. So I wanted to make this video talking about some of my personal favorite games on the original Game Boy. To keep things more focused, I won't be covering any Game Boy Color exclusive games in this video. I plan on making separate videos like this focusing on other consoles in the future, so make sure you're subscribed if you want to see all the stuff I have planned. It's also worth noting that these games won't be in any particular order. I want to try to keep things a bit more laid back, and I don't want to have to worry about rankings and all that stuff. I tend to like games for what they are and try not to compare them to each other too much. But if you want to tell me your own list of personal favorite Game Boy games and how they rank, definitely let me know down in the comments. Now, without any further delay, here are what I consider to be the best games on the Game Boy. Starting out with a bit of an overlooked little series here, we have the Game & Watch Gallery games. I first discovered this series with the 4th entry on the Game Boy Advance, and only asked my mom to buy it because I thought it was going to be a traditional Mario platformer based on the box art that I saw on the store shelf. After getting over my immense disappointment of it basically just being a minigame collection, I started to see the game's appeal. The original Game Boy is home to the first 2 entries in the series, and they're pretty fun. I don't go back to these games very often, but when I do, I can't help but be charmed by the game's use of adorable and expressive sprites, and overall impressive way of seamlessly reimagining these classic Game & Watch titles with a Mushroom Kingdom twist. Across the first 2 entries, my favorite minigames were always Fire, the one that has you catching baby toads and Yoshis being thrown out of a burning castle, and Chef, which features Mario, Luigi, and Peach all cooking together while Yoshi follows you around, catching food in his mouth. The games are super simple, but honestly that's kind of what makes them the perfect thing to just pop into your Game Boy every now and then for a quick play session. And the fact that Nintendo went the extra mile in making all of these games Mario themed when they could have easily just ported the original versions of these games and gotten away with it really makes these Game & Watch Gallery games stand out. Next up is the Kirby Series, and you really can't go wrong with anything Kirby, like ever. The original Game Boy saw a total of 5 Kirby games. Starting with the mainline titles, there's Kirby's Dreamland 1 and 2. The original Kirby's Dreamland is the perfect pocket-sized 2D platformer. It clocks in at about 30 to 45 minutes to beat if you don't die too many times, and you probably won't, because the game is pretty easy. And many people do criticize the game for its short length, but I think it's honestly part of its charm. I don't really see short games as an issue, especially these days. If anything, I really value games with short play times. With there being an endless amount of games available to us at any time thanks to the internet, and the fact that many modern games feel like they drag on for way too long as it is, I find short games like Kirby's Dreamland more appealing than ever these days. I go back to this game all the time when I just feel like some classic retro platforming action that isn't ever frustrating or too difficult like a lot of the games are from this era. And the same can be said for most of the Game Boy's library, except for the difficulty part sometimes, but the Game Boy is just full of short but sweet focused experiences that boiled games of that era down to their core principles, and it just worked really well. Which brings us to Kirby's Dreamland 2. Released in 1995, this amazing sequel took the format of Kirby's Adventure on the NES with its hub areas, boss fights, and now iconic copy abilities, and crunched it down to Game Boy size while adding a whole new mechanic, the also now iconic Animal Buddies. This game really solidified the Kirby formula that we know today. You've got 7 worlds, each with 5 to 7 levels, a variety of environments, and of course the cuteness factor is just cranked up to the max. Both of the Kirby's Dreamland games are ones that I revisit frequently. They are just so easy to pick up and play whenever I'm in the mood for some classic Kirby, and the Game Boy's hardware and form factor suits these easygoing, fun platformers perfectly. Much like what we see with more modern consoles like the 3DS and Switch, Nintendo supplied a handful of Kirby spin-off games to complement the mainline titles. You've got Kirby's Pinball Land, which is a very fun version of pinball featuring 3 boards to roll around on, and it's just some good, clean fun. You've got iconic Kirby enemies all over the place and little bonus games, and it's overall just a really good time. Then there's Kirby's Block Ball, which is your classic Breakout clone, but with Kirby, and honestly probably the best version of Breakout I've ever played. And out of the 3 Kirby spin-offs on the Game Boy, this one definitely has the most content on offer, with a total of 11 worlds broken up into 55 levels, each featuring classic Kirby enemies, bosses, and power-ups. I was actually quite surprised by just how much effort was put into making this game feel like a Kirby game and not so much just a basic Breakout clone like I kind of described it as in the beginning. It's definitely much more than that. And finally, there's Kirbys Star Stacker, a very late Game Boy game releasing all the way in 1997, right before the Game Boy Color came out. I actually played this one for the first time only a couple years ago, and I really like it. It's your classic falling blocks puzzle game, kind of like Tetris, but here you're matching up little animal friends in order to clear blocks. It's a lot of fun once you get the hang of it, and it features a solid level-based single-player mode, which I am always a fan of in these types of puzzle games. They give it more of a sense of progression that I prefer rather than just playing an endless challenge mode. The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening holds a very special place in my heart. I first played this one actually back on the 3DS in 2011 when the Game Boy Virtual Console had just launched. Back then, the slow trickle of Game Boy games on the eShop was really the only thing that kept me actively using my 3DS for a while, until bigger games like Mario 3D Land and Pokemon X and Y finally came out. Thankfully though, one of the first Game Boy games to launch on the 3DS was Link's Awakening, and this game was exactly what I needed at the time. Back then I was on a huge Zelda binge, and the 3DS offered me the most convenient way to experience this game thanks to its save states and the ability to put the game into sleep mode. That was one of the things that always used to stress me out about playing old games in general. Dying and losing progress, or being told by my parents that we had to go somewhere and I had to turn my game off. That used to happen to me all the time when I would play games that didn't allow you to save everywhere back in the day. But on the 3DS, that wasn't an issue because I could just put it in sleep mode and pick it up at any time later. The game itself is classic 2D Zelda at its finest. I've always felt like 2D Zelda works best on a handheld. There's just something really satisfying about exploring a little pocket-sized Zelda world, and the Zelda universe just looks so good in this 8-bit Game Boy style. It's always been one of my favorite looks for the Zelda series. One of my biggest regrets is that I still haven't gotten around to playing the Oracle games on the Game Boy Color, but I plan on changing that soon, and I'm so excited because they just look so good. Next up is the big boy himself, Mario. There are 4 games relating to Mario here that I am absolutely in love with and go back to all the time. So let's just start at the beginning with the original Super Mario Land. This game is by far the most overlooked mainline Mario game in the series. A lot of people will make the argument that it doesn't hold up that well, but I disagree. This game is super unique with its completely original enemies, bosses, locations, and music. The graphics are really interesting because they went for this kind of shrunken down NES look that gave us these super tiny sprites that look kind of weird, but I love them. And this was all kind of a result of it just being the first handheld Mario game, and the people who made it weren't really sure how to make it look yet. And I love that about this game. It really gives it this unique look. And this is actually another one that I originally played on the 3DS back when it launched on the Virtual Console. I never owned a cartridge of it growing up, and because of that, it was always this elusive Mario game to me that I knew existed, but I just never had the means to play it. I didn't know about emulation when I was a kid, obviously. So once I finally did play it, I thought it was great. And also, I love the random shooting levels where Mario just starts flying a plane for some reason. I really hope they bring that back one day. And then Mario Land 2 is just overall the best. This is without a doubt the most interesting 2D Mario game ever. The level variety in this game is so good. Gone are the traditional Mario level themes that you'd come to expect from the series, and instead we have stuff like a spooky Halloween world, the inside of a house, space, and even a wacky funhouse type world that takes place inside of a giant toy Mario. It's so cool and really weird. You have to play this game if you haven't before. It's such a unique game, and unlike anything else we've seen from the series. It's been a long time since we've gotten a brand new 2D Mario game, so I hope whatever Nintendo is working on next takes a page from this absolute masterpiece. And then there's Super Mario Land 3, Wario Land, which I talked about at length after playing it for the first time in my last month of Game Boy video, so if you haven't seen that, you should definitely check that out, but I'll talk about it again here really quick. I was really impressed with this game, and it's definitely become a new favorite of mine. Wario's movement is a bit slower and methodical than Mario's, but because of that slower pace, it really feels like Wario Land was designed specifically for the Game Boy and its tiny screen, even more so than the Mario Land games were. Again, much like with Zelda, I haven't played the Game Boy Color sequels to this game, but I'm hoping to change that really soon because I was blown away by how much I enjoyed Wario Land when I first played it last year. And from what I've heard, the series only gets better, so I'm very, very excited to try the rest of the Wario Land games. And to cap off the Mario section, we have Donkey Kong 94, which is a Mario game in everything but name. When I got this game as a kid, I thought it was just going to be a port of the Donkey Kong arcade game. And for the first few levels, that's what it is, but then, after you beat that last level of the arcade game, the game opens up into this fully fleshed out puzzle platformer that spans over 100 stages, and it is just so good. I talked about this one at length a long time ago in my first month of Game Boy video, but definitely check out Donkey Kong 94 if you haven't played it. I feel like this game always surprises people by just how much content it has packed into it. And finally, you guys probably saw this coming, but how could anyone talk about the Game Boy without mentioning Pokemon? It's obvious, it's cliche, but here it is. And of course here, I'm only talking about the classic red, blue, and yellow that we got here in the West for the original Game Boy. Gonna save Gen 2 for another time. I actually started my Pokemon journey on the Game Boy Advance with the Gen 3 games, but it didn't take long once I discovered my love for the franchise to go back and find copies of the original Game Boy titles. I have such fond memories playing the first generation of Pokemon. I was obsessed with Pokemon Yellow version because back then it was the only game in the series where you could easily obtain every starter Pokemon without needing to trade. As a kid who got into Pokemon through the TV show, this meant everything to me because my favorite Pokemon were of course the ones I saw on TV all the time, so basically Ash's team. Another reason why I always preferred Yellow version was its expanded color palette when played on the Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance, which is what I used when I played this game as a kid. But then eventually I discovered my preferred way to play the original Red and Blue was on the Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo, which adds this really cute border and gives the Pokemon distinct color palettes. I played through Red version again a few years ago in my original month of Game Boy video, and man, these games just have a charm to them that isn't really there anymore in the modern Pokemon games, and it makes me very sad. I would love to one day go back and just sit down with the Gen 1 Pokemon games and complete the Pokédex on original hardware using the link cable and everything, and then connect the games to Pokemon Stadium and beat that with my own team instead of using the horrible rental Pokemon. Oh man, I just have such a soft spot for the early days of Pokemon in general, and no amount of frustration with the modern day Pokemon company can ever take that away from me. But anyway, those are what I consider to be some of the best games on the original Game Boy. I know there are a lot more great ones out there, but again, this is just my personal list, so please let me know what some of your favorites are in the comments. Whether they're the same games that I mentioned here, some different ones, let me know how they rank. I'm curious to see what you guys think. Also, I plan to make more videos like this, just talking about my favorite games on other consoles, and I'd also like to make videos listing more overlooked and underrated games for consoles that I find interesting. So if you enjoyed this one, definitely stick around because there's more to come. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.